Hello everyone, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, host of Reformed GGA, and today I'm going to be doing a review of the CMR-30, and I'm specifically going to be doing this review in contrast to another review that has been out there on the internet for a while by someone who calls himself Nutnfancy. Now, of course, yes, he does actually have a name, but the online moniker that he has chosen to use is Nutnfancy, and so I'm just going to refer to him that way because that's typically the way that he refers to himself in the videos, and so I'm just going to leave it at that. But before we get into that, we're going to do something that's unique to my channel. Unlike a lot of other gun channels that are out there on YouTube, I make my politics and especially my religion a very front and center part of what I do here. There's a couple other channels that are like that, usually small, like mine, but it is very much so a part of who I am, and it's also a part of why I'm an advocate of the Second Amendment in the first place, is because of my religion. For those of you who don't know, I'm a Reformed Christian. I actually have a Reformed Christian channel on YouTube as well. It's called Relationship and Truth, for those of you who are interested. But as I said, my religious convictions are going to be first and foremost in everything that I do. And there's a few channels out there that do it, and there's still a few more that will happen to mention their convictions. For example, a while back I saw a live stream interview between Hank Strange and Military Arms Channel, Tim. And in that interview, Tim from Military Arms Channel was trying to kind of distance himself from a lot of political things that didn't have to do with the Second Amendment and gun rights. And over on the other side, you have Hank Strange saying things like, you know, abortion is basically killing your child. And I'm over here going, yes, amen. You're right, Hank. Although I wouldn't say it quite like he did. I wouldn't say it's like killing your child, though it is killing your child. But nonetheless, I applaud Hank for making his convictions known like that. Hopefully, we in the Second Amendment community, we stand for more than just gun rights. And, you know, there's lots of people that like to compartmentalize it. You know, we're just pro 2A, that's what we want to advance, and we're not going to worry about the other things. But the fact of the matter is, the other things are part of life too. And they all intertwine whether we want to admit that they do or not. And frankly, the kind of person that you are when it comes to the Second Amendment does matter. A person who says, you know, you have the right to use a gun, but also would say that either they're not willing to take a position on it, or would just come out and say that you do have the right to take an innocent life in the womb. Frankly, they're not people that I necessarily want to have guns, to be honest. Yes, I believe in the right to keep and bear arms, but I also believe what the Founding Fathers believed, and that is that the right to keep and bear arms, along with everything else in our government, was something that was meant in the context of a people with virtues. That is, that our government, the American government, was designed for a people that was both religious and moral. And if you try to apply it to a people who are not religious and moral, you're going to see those rights abused. Okay, so I think that, yes, we have the right to stand up for those principles that the Founding Fathers gave to us, but we also have a responsibility to demand the kind of responsibilities that bred them in the first place. Okay, a responsible person can be trusted with a gun. An irresponsible person, though, not necessarily, and that's a reality that we have to come to terms with. Okay. And that is ultimately a moral question, and that means that morality, the morality of gun ownership, is something that we are going to have to discuss at one point or another. Now, as I often do in these videos, I'm going to read a passage from Scripture because I am a Reformed Christian. The basis of our faith is canonical Scripture, what a lot of people would call the Bible, 66 books of the Protestant canon. And technically I'm one of the few that has disputes about some of the canonicity of a couple of the books, but as far as doctrine and theology, that doesn't really apply to anything. because the particular books that I'm talking about, Esther and then also Revelation, is somewhat debatable, less so, but somewhat debatable. Doesn't tend to affect a whole lot of core doctrine and theology for most Reformed folks. But that being said, let's go ahead and do a reading from Scripture. I'm going to be reading out of a book called 1 Chronicles. It's in the Old Testament of the Bible, in case you're wondering. And I'm going to start in chapter 11 and verse 20. It says, "Now Abishai, the brother of Joab, was chief of the 30, and he wielded his spear against 300 men and killed them, and won a name besides the three." That is, the three great men of David is what it's referring to. David was a great king of the Israelites. The Israelites are the main focus of the Bible, especially the Old Testament. All right, so he won a name besides the three. He was the most renowned of the 30 and became their commander, but he did not attain to the three. So he was commander of 30 great men, but not of the chief three men that David had. And then starting in verse 22, it says, "And Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, was a valiant man of Kabzeel, a doer of great deeds. He struck down 2 heroes of Moab. He also went down and struck down a lion in a pit on a day when snow had fallen. And he struck down an Egyptian, a man of great stature, 5 cubits tall," that's about 7.5 feet tall. "The Egyptian had in his hands a spear like a weaver's beam, really big. But Benaiah went down to him with a staff and snatched the spear out of the Egyptian's hand and killed him with his own spear. These things did Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and won a name besides the 3 mighty men. He was renowned among the 30, but he did not attain to the 3. And David set him over his bodyguard." Now, that whole chapter has a lot of other people mentioned in it who did great and fantastic things, military things in battle. But what's interesting is that these mighty men that are being mentioned of David, they're interesting people in that in modern terms we would probably refer to them as kind of a militant band of guerrillas. Military guerrillas, well, not even truly military guerrillas, just kind of vigilante guerrillas at that. What happened at the time is that Israel was in conflict with the neighboring countries, which was fairly frequent in Israel's history. And the neighboring countries were doing things to them that they didn't like. And Israel was at war with them. And David and his men, and early on in David's career, he had ascended to the throne of Israel yet. He was basically a more or less just kind of an ordinary guy. He came from a decent enough family and all that, but wasn't anyone particularly special. But when faced with a threat from outside nations, he started to fight against them. And he wasn't doing it under any official mandate from the Israelite people themselves. He was kind of doing it on his own and gathering people to himself to do it on his own. In fact, the official ruler of Israel at the time, King Saul, didn't really like David very much, and there's quite a bit of history there that you probably should look at if you don't know it already. But he wasn't doing this as a part of an official sanction in any way, but he is still recorded as a great hero in the Bible, and his men are recorded as great heroes in the Bible, great military heroes, not technically military, but great warriors, we'll say, even though what he had done didn't have any official mandate for him. For him, his mandate before God was enough for him. These are the people of God, you are to protect them. And certainly the things that the nations around them were trying to do them were certainly unjust. And then there was the issue of the promised land being promised to them and all those kinds of things. And so David and his mighty men felt justified in what they were doing. What's interesting, though, is that David didn't use these mighty men, these great warriors who are able to take on people, easily twice their size, defeat, basically single-handedly win battles and whatnot. He didn't use these men to try to attain power for himself. Like I said, he was operating more or less as a normal guy trying to attract people to his cause of fighting the enemy. And it had even been prophesied over him that he eventually would be king of Israel, but he never took those men and decided to actually fight the current king of Israel, King Saul at the time, to attain power for himself. And this is something that gets maintained and played out throughout the rest of biblical history and is a modern component of what is truly biblical Christianity, is that biblical Christians are indeed willing to fight. And there have been some Christians who have been pretty serious warriors, very capable warriors, and some pretty cool dudes. But in keeping with those principles, they don't fight simply for themselves. That is what David and his mighty men were avoiding. Yes, it had been said that David would be king of Israel. The current king of Israel at the time wasn't doing a very good job of dealing with the threat from the outside nations. That's why David felt that it was necessary to do these things. But he didn't go up against him directly. He wasn't trying to gain power for himself. He was defending his people. He was defending his homeland. He was trying to fulfill his God-given commission in driving out the nations that God had become displeased with. But he never tried to gain position for himself. He never actually directly went against Saul. There was occasions where he had the opportunity to do so, and those are recorded in Scripture as well. But those situations always ended with him saying, you know what? God is the avenger. We don't have a right to take personal vengeance. That doesn't mean, however, that we don't have a right to defend ourselves and that we don't have a right to defend others. And that's what David and his mighty men were doing. And they were pretty good at it. And they were indeed very capable warriors. And like I said, some pretty cool dudes. Okay, that's part of the history and background of biblical historical Christianity when it comes to the Second Amendment. And also, like I was mentioning, a part of the morality that we have concerning the Second Amendment. Yes, we believe in the right to defend ourselves, but we believe there are also still, even in that, moral obligations. And one of them is that the use of arms is not something that can be taken lightly, and certainly not something that can be used for personal gain. You have a right to defend yourself, but not to avenge yourself. You have the right to defend others, but you do not have the right to use those arms to gain advantage for yourself. Okay, at least an undue advantage for yourself. The right to defend yourself, yes, but as a means of exerting power over people that are not, otherwise a threat to you, who have a proper position in the established culture that you're trying to defend, so on and so forth. No. Okay. That's one of those moral aspects of keeping and bearing arms. And like I said, the two are always going to go hand in hand, and that's what the complaint from the other side is how do we keep people from abusing weapons? Well, you can't prevent all abuses. But what you can do is you can promote, not from the government, but the people themselves can promote good, solid morality. And of course, as a Reformed Christian, I believe that morality should be based in an absolute standard. And as a Christian, I have an absolute standard. It's the Word of God. It doesn't get any higher than that. Okay. Without a moral guide, the Second Amendment is nothing but a free-for-all, and we have to admit that. The Second Amendment, along with the rest of the Bill of Rights and the entire American system as a whole, was designed for a religious and moral people. And the Founding Fathers said that. I think that was actually specifically John Adams, if I remember right, who said that the American system is designed for a religious and moral people. And we have to consider those things. And they understood it as being the responsibility not of the government, but of the people to police themselves as much as possible. You're not going to prevent everyone from doing stupid and wicked and evil things. And taking away guns is not going to change that. People are still going to be evil and stupid and wicked. It's still going to happen. But the people themselves, if they take it upon themselves to be moral, if they take it upon themselves to be ethical, righteous, holy, just, and fair, then the burden that's on the government is significantly less. And that was one of the key aspects of the American system, is that it valued self-regulation as much as possible. The idea was to keep the government out of things as much as you possibly could. Have people and encourage people to regulate themselves as much as possible, and the government doesn't have to do as much. That was the concept, that's the idea, and that's what we need to encourage again. The reason why people don't like that is because you are culturally, not necessarily governmentally, but culturally, you're going to be promoting one set of values over others. Values like don't point guns at people who aren't actually a threat to you, things like that. Don't go around murdering people, things like that. And if you're going to have any basis for saying those kinds of things, you're going to eventually run into the problem of arbitrariness, which is what our system has run into now, because we try to incorporate all kinds of different views. And all the different views that are out there, even in America right now, a lot of them are contradictory to one another. It doesn't work. That's why people don't like the idea of morality in the system, because that morality winds up being fairly exclusive. Historically, America was a Christian nation. Not to say that everyone was Christian or they were biblical Christians like myself, but they had a general Judeo-Christian ethic. And the morality that they understood culturally, not just at the governmental level, but culturally, was generally a Judeo-Christian ethic and morality. And that's what our nation was founded on, like it or not. Even in, I think it was the 1800s, there was a study that was done by the government that the question was asked, is this a Christian nation? And the answer that they came to is, yes, it is. By culture and by design, it was a Christian nation. And those values were what allowed the system to operate as well as it did for as long as it did. And I'm not saying that it was perfect. I'm not saying that it is perfect. I'm not saying that it necessarily will be perfect. But that interplay between rights and responsibilities is something that can only be worked out, at least in the American system, if the people themselves regulate themselves as much as possible and promote self-regulation among themselves as much as possible. Fortunately, that hasn't happened. All right, but enough about that. Let's go ahead and get into the review of the CMR-30 by Kel-Tec. This is the CMR-30. It is a Kel-Tec product, and those of you who know me and know the guns I own know that I have kind of a mixed experience when it comes to Kel-Tec. Currently, I own 3 Kel-Tec products. I've bought 4. One of them I got as a gift for someone else, and that one seems to be doing fine. It was a sub 2000, 9mm sub 2000, the one that takes the Glock mags, and so far that one seems to be doing pretty good. For the 3 other Kel-Tec products that I own, the PMR-30, which is the handgun version of this, although this kind of looks like a handgun, but a very oversized one, but I own the handgun version. And then I also own the RDB, the rifle downward ejecting bullpup, the RDB. I own that one, and I've had some pretty significant issues with that one. The gas piston on mine just simply does not operate correctly, and that blocks up the gun sometimes, which is not a good thing. Especially on a $1,000 gun, you don't want that to be happening. That shouldn't happen when you pay that kind of money for it. But this particular gun I've actually been very impressed with, the CMR-30. And this was actually one of my more recent purchases. I've still had it for quite a while now. At least half a year. Maybe a little bit more, but at least half a year. More than half a year, I would say. And I've put hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, probably well over 1,000 rounds by now. I don't keep very good track, unfortunately. But I take this thing out and I shoot it all the time, and I go through those 200 round packs that CCI puts out of the Maxi Mags, the 40 grain hollow point Maxi Mags. I go through those things like candy with this thing. So I've put a lot of time on this gun, especially given the amount of time that I've owned it. And I've definitely formed an opinion on it. And in response to Nut and Fancy's review, I don't necessarily disagree with him as much as some people might think from the title of this video, but I do disagree with one thing. When it came down to it at when it came down to the brass tacks of it, nutnfancy put forward the CMR-30 as a non-recommend. They recommended that people do not buy it. And he hardly ever does that. A lot of times he'll give things out there with qualifications, saying, you know, if this gun happens to fit these particular needs and so on and so forth, then go ahead and get it. It'll be just fine. Sometimes he'll put qualifications out there like that, you know, if you happen to need this and you can need this, or if you can put up with this, put up with that, then this might be a gun for you. And then there's sometimes where he gives a completely unqualified recommend. It's like, it's a decent gun. There's nothing really significantly that's wrong with it at all. If you're in the market for a gun in this particular caliber in this category, get it. You know, he does that as well too. It's fairly rare that he gives a non-recommend. And the reason why he gave a non-recommend for the CMR-30, which I just showed you, was this: the magazines. And I would agree with nutnfancy that the primary problem that people run into with the CMR-30 is the magazine. And there's a number of issues that show up with this. Where I would disagree with nutnfancy is his statement that the issues with the magazine are so significant that he would not recommend that anyone buy the gun. Okay. I've had a lot of experience with the gun. And like I said, easily over 1,000 rounds. I'm not exactly sure how many over 1,000 rounds. And like I said, I've gone through tons of those 200 round packs. Well, not tons, but quite a few of those 200 round packs that CCI puts out of the 40 grain maxi mags, which by the way run just fine in that gun. Any of the heavier weights have run just fine in it. The 40 grainers, 45 grainers, 50 grainers, basically anything that's 40 grain and above that comes from a decent manufacturer, just not the really cheapier or foreign stuff, you know. All have run really great in it. But where I would differ with nutnfancy is saying that the magazine issues, which do exist, are big enough to make it so that you should not buy the gun, to make it an absolute non-recommend. Okay, I would say that it is a non-recommend with qualifications, and the qualifications are that you're willing to put in the time to get these mags to a point where they're going to be decently operable for your gun. So let's go ahead and talk about what you need to do to these magazines to make them work. And I own about 10 of these little suckers. And the reason why I own a lot of them is because first problem that you need to get past is the fact that they're not overly easy to load. Now, there are out there on the market are various speed loaders for the CMR-30 mags, which is also the same as the PMR-30 mags. They're interchangeable. And those speed loaders definitely would help. I don't happen to have any of them though, just because I never really got around to it, and with the way that I do it, I never found it super necessary. The way I've done it is I just buy a bunch of magazines. I have 10 magazines, load them all up before I go out shooting, and then just use them as I shoot. I don't have to worry about loading it up in the field. And so being able to do it quickly and easily isn't as big of an issue for me. But if you don't have as many magazines, then yeah, it could be a bit of an issue. But learning how to load the magazine correctly is one of the biggest issues that I see out there. And in nutnfancy's video, you know, he emphasized that, you know, he had worked with the PMR-30, which is the small little handgun version of this one, which I own, and it's a somewhat decent gun. I would recommend it to people with qualification as well, but frankly more qualifications than this one. This one, once I figured out what was going on with the magazines, has been flawless from that point. Now initially I did have lots of problems with it, lots of malfunctions with it, there's no lie. Out of the box, this thing will give you malfunctions, but it's because of the magazine. So that's what needs to be addressed. And I would definitely be lying if I said that there were no malfunctions with this gun. But, as I'm saying, once I figured out what was going on with the magazines, I got around that. Alright, so let's take a little bit closer look at the magazine. As you look at it, try to hold it somewhat steady here, you'll notice that it has a very interesting profile. And you'll notice that there's actually a cutout kind of in the middle of it. It's actually a lot more like the kind of magazine that you might see for a rifle. And it actually works a lot more like a rifle magazine than it does a typical handgun magazine. And a lot of people think of it as a handgun magazine because it was originally designed for the PMR-30. Let me see if I can just get that thing out here. And by the way, this has been safety checked as well. But this is the PMR-30, and it does take these mags. And a lot of people, when they think of these mags, they think of them as handgun magazines, because originally they were made to go with this handgun. But in loading them, they don't really load like a handgun magazine does. Instead, what's going to happen is that you're going to feed not from the front like you do with a normal handgun magazine. And this is something I'm going to fault Nutnfancy for. He said, oh yeah, we did everything just right with the magazine. We know how to load them correctly and all those things. And then he shows you footage in his review of them loading it incorrectly, of them loading it from the front. It's not designed to be loaded from the front. And in the Kel-Tec manual, it talks about that. It's not designed to be loaded from the front. Instead, it's from the top. That little cutout back there is where you put the rim of the cartridge into. And by the way, this is a 22 Magnum gun. And so it takes 22 Magnum rounds. And this right here happens to be the Hornady Critical Defense 45 grain round. And this is actually a pretty fantastic little round. And I found that it runs just fine. And I've also found that these give really good expansion despite being relatively cheap rounds. In my area, I can get them for about 28 cents a round, which is really cheap for defensive ammunition. And they actually expand real well in most of the mediums that I've seen them be shot into. And so, for the price, this is actually pretty good. When they expand out, they're roughly the same size, at least same diameter as a 9mm full metal jacket round would be. Not as a 9mm hollow point, but as a 9mm full metal jacket. So is that terribly effective? Not as effective as it could be. We'll get into purpose of use here in a second, but still punches well above its weight. Most people don't think of 22 Magnum as a very powerful round, but there are some 22 Magnum rounds that you can get that actually are pretty good, and this is one of them. But again, the idea is you're not going to load it from the front. You actually put it in from the top, and then you're going to keep alternating as to which side you push it towards. It's an alternating magazine. It's a stagger stack magazine. So the first one will go in, and going in the direction of the gun, it's going to be on the right. This is my right over here. Could be reversed for you guys watching this. But this is on my right, so first one I'm going to put in on the right, and I'm going to actually push and make sure that it actually goes in on the right. And then the second one I'm also going to push in from the top. And as I'm pushing it back, I'm making sure that I keep it to the opposite side, so now it's in the left. So now you have one on the right, one on the left. And as I go through, I keep doing that. I keep making sure that these rounds are fully seated on each side of the magazine, and frankly it does take a while. And that's why a lot of people like the speed loaders. And as I go through, I'll take it and I'll tap it on the heel of my palm, the back of the magazine. Okay, you can see the tips up there up front. I'm tapping it on the back, and that's just to make sure that the rims are fully seated at the back of the magazine. And as long as I do that every 2 or 4 rounds, I find that with an even number it tends to work best. It works out pretty good. And every so often I'll look at the magazine from the front, and I'll try to make sure that the front of the bullet is above the magazine itself. And as long as I can see the tip of the bullet above the magazine, I know that they're being loaded correctly and they're not going to have an issue running into the front of the magazine, because that can't happen. Okay. As long as you do that, it runs up pretty good. So learning how to load them is one of the biggest issues that people come into. Now, unfortunately, that isn't the end of the magazine issue. If that was the only issue with the magazine, this gun would probably sell a whole lot better and people would buy it with a lot more confidence. But unfortunately, there are some other issues that can happen with the magazine as well. So in addition to being loaded improperly, people not making sure that you go all the way to the left, all the way to the right with the bullets, making sure that the ends are fully seated at the back of the magazine, which is something that you normally wouldn't want to worry about, admittedly. And this kind of makes the gun a little bit of a pain in that regard. And like I said, I usually load up all of my magazines before I go out shooting, because I don't want to have to deal with that then. And when I do that, it's great, and everybody who uses the gun absolutely loves it, as long as they're dealing with preloaded magazines. For people who actually have to load the magazine and learn how to load it, they don't like it. Okay, freely admit. Okay, so that's one issue with the magazine, is people just incorrectly loading it from the front, or just pushing and pushing and pushing it and not making sure that it's fully seated on each side and all the way back. All of those will create problems. So loading the magazine is the first hurdle to overcome. Another one is just inconsistent quality control, and this is Kel-Tec. Kel-Tec is infamous for inconsistent quality control. And primarily, there's two areas where the quality control can get out of spec with regard to the magazines. One of them is the follower. With some of them, not all of them, but with some of them, the follower will be out of spec such that it actually binds up in the magazine body. Right now I'm just taking apart the magazine. They take down like most magazines do. A little stiff, but not too bad. Alright, so all that I did there is just pushed on the detent on it, took off the base plate. Now there's the little, I'm not sure what the name for that is, to be honest, but it's basically the button that fits into the base plate. So we'll just call it the piece of plastic that has the button on it. Then you take out the spring, and there's two springs that you'll find with these. With older magazines, they'll have this black spring in there that's kind of weak, and I actually like this one because it doesn't actually produce binding as much in my experience. But a lot of them will have this weak spring in it, and I like that. But the main culprit is actually the follower, and we'll get that out. Okay, so as far as inconsistent quality control is concerned with Kel-Tec, there's two places where that shows up, and the first one is in the follower. What will happen with some of them is the follower won't do what this one just did. This one, I dropped it in there and it went all the way to the end of the magazine, and that's what should happen with the follower. It should be such that it will go back and forth in the magazine very easily. But with some of them it won't. It'll get stuck partially part of the way through. And if it does that, if it gets stuck somewhere in the middle of the magazine tube, then what's going to happen is when you're shooting it, you're going to have the gun vibrating, motion back and forth, the bullets are going to start vibrating back and forth, and you're going to have a follower that's prone to binding, and the bullets themselves, just because they're so long and narrow, 22 Magnum is a very long and narrow round, it's going to kind of exacerbate that, and it's going to wind up binding, and what will happen is the follower won't actually come all the way up anymore. It'll get stuck down here somewhere, and the bullets won't even come to the top of the magazine, and if that happens, yeah, you're not going to have the next round be fed. So that's going to be a big issue. So you want to make sure that that follower goes back and forth in the magazine tube like it's supposed to, and if it doesn't, what you can do is you'll see that there are little rails on the follower on both sides, and those little rails you can sand down. Don't sand down the whole thing, just those little rails. Okay, give you another view of those rails there. Okay. Those rails you can sand down, so here's one rail, here's another rail. Same thing on the other side. Rail here, rail here. You take those and you sand them down. Now some people will go through and they'll get, really fine sandpaper to sand it down. I personally have not found that to be terribly useful, because part of the problem of why it binds up is just because of how much surface area you have in contact. You have a lot of surface area on the follower, you have a lot of surface area inside the magazine tube itself, and all that surface area will create more friction and cause it to bind up. So I actually use a relatively rough device to sand with. I use an actual file. Now, of course, I don't use the actual rasp side. That would definitely be too coarse. So this rasp side and this other rasp side over here I don't use. But the little bit finer file, it's not nearly as fine as a lot of the special sandpapers, but the finer sides I do use. Just take it on the rail, scratch it a bit, not too finely, but scratch off a little bit, and do that to all sides, and then go ahead and stick it back in the magazine tube and test it and see if it works like it's supposed to. And once I get it to the point where it's doing what this one's doing, where it freely falls back and forth and I don't have to, and it doesn't get stuck anywhere in the middle, then I know that the follower is taken care of and I don't have to worry about the follower binding up in the magazine. Okay, so once you learn how to load the magazine correctly, and you make sure that the follower isn't going to bind, there is one more issue that can happen with the magazine that I found, and I'll talk about that. But this is a relatively simple fix. Learning how to correctly load the magazine, like I just showed you guys, making sure that the bullets are fully seated left, right, left, right, left, right, or however you start, and then making sure that they're all the rims are firmly seated at the back, you know, tapping it on the palm of your hand or on the table or something. That's annoying, but you can learn how to do that, taking apart the magazine and sanding down the rails on the follower so that they'll actually slide freely back and forth like it's supposed to. That is pretty easy to do. I took apart the magazine with just a ballpoint pen. It's not like it's overly complicated. Most magazines aren't. Okay, just being honest here. All right, so putting this thing back together. And like I said, I have found the magazines that have the weaker spring to be a little bit better, just in that they're less likely to bind up. Alright, so magazine is back together, and me, I'm weird, I always like to test to make sure that it's going to work right. And by the way, I do use just a little bit of lube in my magazines, just usually a little bit of CLP, nothing super fancy. And so when rounds go through it, it winds up lubing it up a little bit more, but that's usually not the major issue. Alright, so we have talked about loading the magazine correctly. You do it from the top, decidedly to one side, the other, every few rounds. Smack it on the back of your palm, table, whatever, to make sure that the rims are fully seated to the back. Then take it apart and check the follower, make sure that it goes back and forth like it's supposed to. If it doesn't, sand down the rails on the follower. And you don't have to use super fine sandpaper. You're trying to minimize contact surface area, not increase it. And so something that's fairly coarse you can use pretty well. Then there's one last area of quality control that Kel-Tec frankly fails at when it comes to the magazine, and that is how far up the magazine sits in the gun. Now this one usually works just fine in the CMR-30, but with the PMR-30, the handgun version, doesn't always work so well. Let me see if I can show you what I mean here. Alright, so the magazine is loaded into the gun, and I don't know if you can see it, but I can actually press up on this and there's a little bit of play in the magazine once it's loaded into the gun. And in a lot of guns there's going to be a little bit of play in the magazine once you load it in, but in these things there should not be. So this magazine would not run well in the pistol. Now this magazine does happen to run just fine in the CMR-30, and even at that there's still a little bit of play. But sometimes even the CMR-30 and the PMR-30 for that matter will sometimes fail to strip off the top round. And the reason why they fail sometimes to strip off the top round is because the magazine isn't sticking up far enough. So the solution to that is actually pretty simple. This little catch right here, it's a heel catch design. And this little catch right here is what holds the magazine in place, keeps it from falling out. And if this catch is low enough on the magazine, well, the magazine is also going to sit low. You want the magazine to sit as far as high up as possible. So what that means is you need to make this catch bigger going down. So right underneath this catch, what I've done in my guns is right along the bottom of that catch I'll actually put a little bead of super glue, just blue Loctite. I haven't done it to this magazine because, like I said, I run it in the CMR-30 and it seems to run just fine out of there. Sometimes not the first round, but just push the magazine all the way up and then it will feed all the other rounds just fine from there. So I don't usually worry about modifying it, but with the pistol it does become an issue. So with the pistol magazines, what I've done is I just take some blue Loctite, run a little bead along the bottom of the catch, and let it dry, test it out in the gun, see if there's any play in it or not, if I can still get it out, whatnot. And often take the file here and just sand it down to whatever I need it to make sure that it fits nice and flush and tight. Let me see if I can pull out one of those magazines here. Yeah, here is one that I've done that. And you can see that there's definitely a little bit of super glue on there. A little bit of that blue Loctite. And what it does is it makes it so that there's absolutely no play in that magazine anymore. So this is the one that has had that modification. This one is unmodified. There's a little bit of play. This one, put a little bit of blue Loctite on the bottom of the magazine catch, sand it down to the level where it works well, and you put that in there, there's no play at all. Makes it much more reliable. Those are the things that happen with the magazine, and they do cause problems, and they can be very frustrating for people who don't know that those are the issues. And unfortunately, I think it has gained an unwarrantedly negative opinion out there of the CMR-30 and the PMR-30 for that matter. Both of them suffer from the same problem. It's issues with the magazine. People don't know how to load it correctly. You have to put it in from the top. There's that little loading window for a reason. You put it in from the top. You push it all the way to the left, all the way to the right, all the way back. Tap it every few rounds to make sure that it's fully seated. That becomes an issue. Then people don't know that the followers are not consistent in their quality. You have to take the magazine apart, test the follower, sand down the rails if you need to get it so that it flows freely back and forth. Put the magazine together, and then finally the magazine might not be pushed up all the way that it should be. And so sometimes on the bottom of the magazine catch you need to put a little bead of super glue, and sometimes a few layers, it's okay. Sometimes a few layers to make sure that it fits in there nice and snug and can't come out or wiggle around. But once you've done all that, this thing becomes an entirely different animal. This gun is incredibly fun to shoot, and most of what nutnfancy said in his review about the ergonomics, how fun it is to shoot, how accurate it is, all those kinds of things are 100% true. The only area where I really disagree with him is whether or not this should be a general non-recommend or a qualified recommend. That's the big difference. I would say that it's a qualified recommendation. If you know what to do with the magazines to make them work, then the gun works. If you don't know what to do with the magazines, or you're just simply not willing to do the work to make them work, well then yeah, the gun's going to be pretty useless to you. And it all comes into, do you want to put in the time to make it work for you? And I think there is a segment of the population out there that would be willing to do that. I'm part of that. And what I use this gun for, as long as we're talking about purpose of use here, and then eventually we need to get around to that in a review. What I use this for is my traveling bedside gun. The reason why I selected this for my traveling bedside gun is because this thing is incredibly light, and the ergonomics on it are absolutely fantastic, and it's very travelable. Fold in the stock here, have a folding vertical foregrip on there. It is a little bit under 24 inches when everything is said and done, and I have a case that I fit in my backpack, and you guys have seen that case back here. A case that fits into my suitcase just fine, and so it's very travelable and it's very light. And a box of 50 rounds is also very light, but it's still a big enough cartridge that it is a viable self-defense option, especially if you run good ammunition and good hollow points in it that do in fact expand. And coming out of a full-length barrel instead of a handgun barrel, 22 and 22 Magnum rounds, if they're good quality rounds, they actually do expand. And like I said, they expand to roughly the size of a full metal jacket, 9mm, at least in width, maybe not in length, but at least in width. And so they are viable. And this thing holds 30 rounds. And 30 rounds in your hand ready to go when there's a bump in the night is pretty powerful. But like I said, it's very light, it's easy to transport. The ammunition does not weigh very much, it also does not take up very much space. To me, it made sense as a good option for when I'm traveling. Now, are there other options that are out there? Yes, there certainly are, and I think a lot of the other options that are out there would be good. One of the ones that Nut and Fancy would mention would be the Sub 2000 in 9mm or in 40 cal, because the Sub 2000 comes in both. And yeah, that is a perfectly viable option, and I'm not opposed to it, and I may even bring that up as a kind of a secondary one. But this is a lighter system. The Sub 2000 is a little bit heavier. The base configuration for this one is 3.8 pounds, and the base configuration for the Sub 2000 is like 4.2, 4.25, something like that, 4.25 pounds. So it's a little bit heavier. It does have a harder hitting round, which is nice, but it's a little bit heavier, and the ammunition weight is definitely different. Like I said, a box of 50 22 Magnums does not weigh what's the same that a box of 59mm rounds does. The weight is definitely vastly different, and then also the handling features are very different. This gun has just excellent ergonomics. It has an ambidextrous safety, and Nut and Fancy talked about this in his review as well. And for me, it's pretty easy to hit that safety. I'm hitting it with the first segment of my thumb, but it's pretty easy to make contact with. And it does have an actual slide stop. So here's the SAP, here's the slide stop, and that's pretty natural for anyone who uses handguns. The combination of those two and the order that those two are in, it's very natural, very easy to get used to. The charging handles are very big, easy to get a good grasp on. Most people, there are some people that won't be able to do it, who don't have very good grip strength. I have a relative who's like that, who doesn't have a whole lot of grip strength and can't really rack it, but most people can rack it and operate it just fine. This little button right here where my index finger is, that controls the stock, and so it's a multi-adjustable stock. To pull it out, you don't need to mess with the button, but to bring it to different levels in, you do. But that's pretty good placement there, very natural placement. And like I said, I bought the Sub 2000 for someone else, and I did shoot it and play with it and all those kinds of things, and I've put some time in on it. And just handling wise, I don't think that the Sub 2000 is as good a handler as this one. And then another issue is the ease of mounting optics. The CMR-30 here, very easy to mount optics on it. It comes with some pop-up sights. Forgive the sound in the background. It comes with pop-up sights. I am not a huge fan of pop-up sights. Instead, I like these little hollow sun red dots, and as you can see, this is one of the solar models. These things are just on all the time, and they last, somewhere between 1 and 3 years for most people. Me, I basically replace the battery when I replace the batteries for the smoke detectors in my apartment. That's basically the schedule, and it's always on, it's always ready to go. And red dots like this are usable in a wide variety of lighting conditions. You can use them in relatively dim light, relatively bright light. It doesn't work super great if you're looking directly into a light, because then the red dot will wash out, but in most other situations the red dot works very well. And on the Sub 2000, mounting a red dot is a little bit more difficult, just because it's a folding gun design, and so there are some issues with mounting optics when the gun folds over on itself right where the optic would normally be. That's a little bit of a problem. And so if you want something like a red dot, Sub 2000 going to present some problems. And like I said, the 22 Magnum is not an overly powerful round. It's not. Okay, let's just be honest. It's still rimfire. It's, definitely nowhere near a 50 BMG or most centerfire options for that matter. But the 22 Magnum is not to be underestimated either. Out of this gun, a lot of your 40 grain type projectiles like the Maxi-Mag and those ones, and I find that Maxi-Mag usually functions the best out of this one, will give you around 300 foot-pounds of energy. Not great, but that is more than most 380s, and if you're traveling with a 380, well, this thing's going to be at least comparable to that. And 300 foot-pounds gets you at least pretty close to 9mm, at least 9mm out of a handgun, and so that works. But the main reason why I like having a gun like this at my bedside when I'm traveling is because it's something that you can shoulder. and something that you can shoulder is going to be much more forgiving in terms of accuracy than any handgun is going to be. And me, I'm recoil sensitive, and so I don't shoot handguns particularly well in the first place. And I've gone through quite a few handguns trying to find something that shoots well for me. And so far, the best handgun for me has proven to be this little PMR-30. I don't like overly relying on it because this one it still malfunctions once in a while. And I don't like a gun that malfunctions once in a while. I've got it down to the point where it'll malfunction about once in 5 magazines. And remembering that the magazines hold 30 rounds, that's 1 every 150 rounds. That's not terrible. I think that's functional for a self-defense firearm. Some people wouldn't want it anywhere nearly that high, but considering that it's rimfire, and considering that, you know, your first round, as long as you actually do chamber a round, those kinds of things, the first round is basically always guaranteed to go off, and when I do have malfunctions with it, it's usually at least halfway through the magazine. That's at least 15 rounds into it. You know, it's not bad. It's doable in the context of most citizen-involved self-defense shootings. Most citizen-involved self-defense shootings are usually over within 5 shots. There are occasions where you need more, but most of them are over in 5 shots, and this thing I know will give me at least 5 shots of reliable shooting. And oftentimes, the vast majority of the time, it will give me more. It's still not perfect, but in terms of being able to hit what I'm aiming at and hit it fairly precisely, this is my best gun, and it's just because I'm so recoil sensitive, and this doesn't have a lot of recoil. And out of this gun, the .22 Magnum has more or less the same kinetic energy as a .380. And combine that with a good hollow point, like the Hornady Critical Defense 45 grain FTX projectiles, it actually does a lot better than you might think. I'm not saying that it's just as good as a high-powered .380 out of a fairly long barrel. It's not. But compared to, say, like the Ruger LCP, that itty-bitty little micro thing, they're actually going to give about the same performance, because out of that little gun, .380 bullets, hollow points wouldn't expand very well. The FTX projectiles, even out of this gun, actually do expand pretty well. And so it's at least comparable in that regard. It is viable, and the .22 Magnum round for home defense, self-defense, does better than a lot of people think that it does. I'm not saying that it's as good as most of your centerfire options. Okay, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that it is a lot better than a lot of people think that it is. But in terms of handling characteristics and how light it is, and also how light the ammunition is, this wound up being a better option for me than a lot of the other stuff that's out there. Like I said, its primary competitor is another Kel-Tec product, the Sub 2000, which is a normally 9mm gun. You can also get them in 40 cal that folds. And so again, it makes it something that's really easy to take around with you, that you can put in a suitcase relatively easily. And of course, you'll need to check the rules of the jurisdiction that you're going to make sure that it's legal and all those kinds of things. And then also there's the policy of the hotels that you're visiting. Some hotels have a strict no weapons policy, etc., etc. You'll need to check on all those kinds of things. But for me, this winds up being a much better option. It is definitely lighter than the Sub 2000 in terms of the gun itself, and also in terms of packing around extra ammo. And then the handling characteristics are much better with this gun than with the Sub 2000. Okay, the Sub 2000, just for me, does not handle as well as this one. This one has controls that for me are much more familiar. They're very similar to handgun controls, because it was based on a handgun. And so most people who are familiar with guns at all, that are familiar with semi-auto handguns, can pick this up and operate it fairly easily. Charging handle is not bad at all. The charging handle on the Sub 2000 is actually pretty rough, but this one has a pretty easy to operate charging handle. And because it's .22 Magnum, yeah, it's 300 foot-pounds of kinetic energy, but that's still not very high by comparison. And the fact that you're able to shoulder it and put 2 hands on it makes it very controllable, very manageable, and it's really easy to get very fast, very accurate follow-up shots with this thing that frankly I cannot do with the Sub 2000. I'm recoil sensitive in the first place, but the Sub 2000, compared to the power of the round that it shoots and its weight, it's not a very heavy gun. it is not a very manageable gun. You'll fire the round and it will bounce around a little bit. This one, it bounces around a little, but not by much, especially by comparison. It is very easy to hold it on target and take care of whatever you need to take care of. Okay, so for me, this is an awesome traveling bedside gun, and that's what I use it for. nutnfancy, when he reviewed it, he saw it mostly as a bug-out kit gun, and I don't think this gun would be bad at that. If I was to do a bug-out kit gun based on the CMR-30, I would definitely change out the optic though. This gun is easily capable of 1.5 MOA, but you're not really going to see that, especially at longer range, with a little red dot on it. The red dot is meant for close quarters, varying light conditions. If you want a bug-out kit gun, red dot is probably not going to be your best bet. You'd probably want an actual hunting optic on it. But other than that, I would keep it basically in the same configuration. I would just trade out the optic for a hunting optic instead of a red dot. But what nutnfancy talks about it with being a good bug-out kit option, I would agree with him on that. It is a good bug-out kit option, and utterly fantastic that way. But he kind of downplayed its role as a self-defense weapon, and I wouldn't do that. I would say that for particular segments of the population that want to have a bedside gun that they can shoulder, but want something that is very, very, very light, very weight efficient, that is easily one of the best options out there. And it definitely beats a 22. A 22 out of a rifle is only going to give you 125, maybe 150 foot-pounds. If you get a decently long rifle and a decently hot cartridge, you could get 150 foot-pounds of energy. This thing's 300. Like I said, it's getting into 9mm territory, at least handgun 9mm territory. And with a good expanding bullets, or at least a good tumbling bullets, and a lot of the 22 Magnum rounds will tumble if they don't expand, it really does become a pretty decent contender. I'm not saying that it's perfect, I'm not saying it's as powerful as the others, but for a certain segment of the population that wants a gun that they can travel with, that's not going to have a lot of weight to it, and it doesn't, and its ammo doesn't have a lot of weight either, that wants a lightweight bedside gun that they can shoulder and also has a very manageable recoil, this thing starts looking like a lot better option. And it is. And once you can get the issues with the magazine figured out, you figure out how to load it from the top, very intentionally pushing to one side and then the other, one side and then the other, and every few rounds, usually either every 4 or every 2 rounds, smacking it on the heel of your palm to make sure that those rounds are fully seated all the way to the back. Take it apart and make sure that the follower doesn't bind in it, and if it does, sand down the rails like I showed you. And then finally, sometimes it won't strip off the top round, even if the rounds come all the way up. Sometimes it won't strip off the top round, and the reason why is because it's just not sitting far enough up in the gun. If that happens, right underneath the catch, you'll need to put in some of that blue Loctite to make sure that it actually rests on something else other than just the catch. You'll need to push it up a little bit. And putting some blue Loctite on the bottom of the catch will take care of that. Make it fit up there nice and snug, and once you do all of that, which I admit is a bit of a process, this thing becomes very, very, very fun. And like I said, I have not had a serious issue with this gun ever since I figured out all those things about the mag. And yeah, it took a while to figure out all those things, but once I did, no major issues. Now, I'm saying no major issues because there are still minor things that would fall into the category of use or cause malfunctions. One of the biggest ones is that on the CMR-30 mags, I don't put in that little bead of super glue to push it all the way up. Instead, all I do is I make sure that the magazine is fully seated, rack the action, and let that operate it. But if I let the magazine fall down just a little bit, because there's still a little bit of play in these ones, if I let the magazine fall down a little bit, then sometimes it doesn't strip off that top round. But once I get the first round to feed, then the rest of them always feed just fine. And of course, if you're using this as a bedside gun, you've of course loaded it before you need it, and you'd know whether or not it fed the round or not, hopefully. And it's also pretty easy to check. Just pull a little bit back on it, take a look inside the chamber, and see if the round actually fed or not. It's very simple that way. So there are some issues with that. Sometimes it doesn't quite feed the top round, but that's only because on these magazines I haven't put in that extra little bit of super glue, that little bit of blue Loctite on the bottom of the catch to make sure that it seats up there all the time. It's just one of those things that if I don't absolutely need to do it, I don't like to do modifications that I don't need to do. And like I said, it's just the first round that it does it on, and so as long as I just push up on the magazine and rack it, it'll take it just fine. But you can do what I did with the handgun magazines, and you can put that little bit of blue Loctite on there, and it pushes it up there firmly, and it prevents all of those kinds of issues. But yeah, as far as real issues, once I've got it loaded, and then once I've got it to take the first cartridge, it is absolutely fantastic. And I have not had any malfunction going through the magazine. Like I said, sometimes it won't feed the top round, but that's because I don't seat the magazine all the way like I'm supposed to. And I refuse to put the blue Loctite on the bottom of the ones for the CMR. And that's just me. I don't like to modify something if I don't have to. But if you want to get rid of that problem, you can put it on there, and it'll take care of the issue right away. But aside from that, flawless. It is a great running little gun, and like I said, it is you can just sit there and hammer with it. There's very little recoil. It makes it very easy to get back on target, and you can just sit there and punch and punch and punch. This week I went shooting with a friend, and we were mostly just playing around, and this sighting system that I have in here gets out of alignment from time to time, and you need to readjust. But we had some targets that we'd set up, and I was firing from the shoulder, not from bench or anything, but just from the shoulder, offhand, and shooting this 8-inch target, and I was just aiming at the same place on it offhand, just punching basically as fast as I could, thinking that I could hit the target, and it produced a group that was about that size. The target was about 25 yards away or something like that. But this is not me taking any great strides. I'm not sitting there trying to really aim or anything like that. It's just put the red dot on the center of the target every time you fire. That's all that I was doing. I wasn't taking any great strides to line it up or anything like that. Just went bing, 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 and naturally I got a group that was about that size. And that makes for a pretty good heart shot, that makes for a pretty good head shot, and in a home defense situation, a bedside use, that's more than enough accuracy to do anything that you're going to need to do, quite frankly. And if you decide to actually get serious with it and actually sit down and rest it and all those kinds of things, like I said, 1.5 MOA is not overly difficult with this gun. Even though it's a semi-auto and all those things, it's actually a pretty accurate little thing. And like I said, you can just sit there and hammer away with it, and you got 30 rounds. If you can't take care of whatever threat you're dealing with in 30 rounds, that's a pretty serious threat. And the odds are that a lot of other guns probably wouldn't have been able to deal with it either. Okay, if your option is, carrying a handgun because it's lighter, and handguns are, and a bigger caliber that if you're like me, you're more prone to miss with, and most people are that way. It's harder to run a handgun. It just is. So it's either, for me especially, because I'm very recoil sensitive, and especially at night, if something happens and I'm trying to shoot a handgun, especially if I don't have my glasses on or something like that, trying to see the sights and all those kinds of things, and how you kind of have the sleep stupor going on and all that, odds are that I would miss with a handgun. And I might carry with me for roughly 4 pounds of weight of the gun. You can get a pretty good size handgun for that, and certainly with additional carry ammo you could do that. All the normal calibers would certainly be available to you. But you know what, a miss with a 45 isn't worth a whole lot. It's a miss, and for me that's what I would see happening. I'm just not very good with handguns. This though, inside of room distances, I can hit whatever I want to hit with it without trying very hard at all. It just doesn't take much effort with this thing. And so for me, I'm going to go for something that I can confidently get the hit with. and that's why I chose it. Is it the right gun for everyone? No. And is everyone willing to put up with the issues with the magazine that you have to get over, learning how to load the magazine properly, dealing with the follower issue, making sure that it slides back and forth like it's supposed to, and then, if necessary, putting that little bit of blue Loctite on the bottom of the magazine catch to make sure it actually goes all the way up in the gun? Is everyone going to want to deal with that? Of course not. Okay, and I get that. And so, for a lot of people buying this gun, I would recommend it with a certain amount of caution, but I would recommend it for people who are willing to put up with all those kinds of things and have a similar purpose of use. Like Nut and Fancy said, good bug out kit option, and in my particular case, it's a good bedside gun for people who travel. It is going to be less weight than, say, the Sub 2000, which would be similarly small. It's also very size efficient, but it's going to be a heavier system. You have heavier bullets, you have heavier gun, it's just going to be a heavier system. So to me, if you want a bedside gun that you can shoulder, it makes sense to go with something that is lighter. And then also follow-up shots with that thing are a lot easier than the Sub 2000. The Sub 2000 is a very bouncy gun. And granted, you might be able to get used to it, and you would probably do well enough to get the job done with it. But follow-up shots are so much easier with this thing. Like I said, I was just a couple of days ago, I was firing offhand. Basically did a magazine dump at an 8-inch target about 20-25 yards away. Got a group that was about that size, and like I said, within room distances, 20 yards would certainly be within that for most people. That makes a good heart shot, that makes a good head shot, central nervous system shot very easily, and I was just going as fast as I could get the red dot back on target, and it was just fine. I cannot do that with a Sub 2000. With the Sub 2000, either I'm going to have to take a lot more time between shots. It's not going to be just boom, 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 boom. It's going to be boom, gun flies somewhere, pull it back, realign, shoot. So it's either going to take longer, or if I try to go quickly, it's just going to be spread out all over the place. I'm not saying that the Sub 2000 can't be suitably accurate in those distances. It's just a harder gun to control. It's just a bouncy gun. And so for me, better option. But the Sub 2000 is not a bad option, and actually I plan on eventually getting a Sub 2000 for myself. I like the concept behind it. I just don't think that it fits my purpose of use most of the time. Most of the time I want something that is very much so lighter and also easier to get better follow-up shots with. And this one is like that. And then also recreationally, I like shooting this thing, and 22 ammunition has come down in price, and in my particular area 9mm ammo is going up in price, so that my 22 Magnum is actually about the same cost as my 9mm now if I'm going brass case to brass case. And so in terms of how much it costs to go out and shoot the guns, this really wouldn't be significantly different from the Sub 2000 now that I decide to run brass through. Now if you decide to do aluminum case ammo, when you're talking about 9mm or whatever other cartridge you happen to like, then that's a little bit different issue. If you're using aluminum case or steel case or something like that, then yeah, you might be able to bring the ammunition down. But comparing brass case to brass case, this competes with a lot of centerfire cartridges in terms of cost. Maybe not in terms of power, but in terms of cost. And this thing is just fun to shoot. Like I said, it's not very punishing at all. The recoil is not bad. It's enough to get the job done if you need to. But very fun. And that's another thing I like about it. Sometimes when I go out to different places, I can find a place to shoot there. Sometimes on a friend's private property. Sometimes there are ranges that are friendly to out-of-state visitors and those kinds of things. And when I find those, I want to be able to shoot. And in a self-defense encounter, I don't think I'm going to need, 300 rounds with me. Okay, seriously. But a lot of times, I usually have around 150 to 300 rounds with me, sometimes as many as 450 rounds with me, because I do shoot it recreationally. And if I go somewhere, I want to be able to spend an hour or two just blinking away and having fun with it. And I do. And I can do that with this gun relatively easily. And like I said, it's not punishing at all. Okay, I have some back problems, unfortunately, now, and I've always kind of had joint issues. And I'm also recoil sensitive and all the things, and for me, this gun just works better. But like I said, this Sub 2000, if you want a bedside gun that's a little bit harder hitting, because it does come in 40 cal and in 9mm, and you're willing to deal with some of the awkwardness of getting a sight put on it, some kind of an optic put on it. And the default sights that I have aren't necessarily bad, but if you're talking about a low light situation, which you might encounter using it as a bedside gun, I don't like using the open sights as much, and they're not quite as instinctive as a red dot. But if you're willing to put up with those kinds of issues, the nice thing about the Sub 2000 is you don't really have the same kinds of magazine issues that you need to worry about. And it is a more powerful gun, harder to charge, definitely a heavier trigger pull. This one's trigger pull is only about 4 pounds, whereas the Sub 2000 has a trigger pull usually somewhere in the 8 to 10 pound range. I think I've heard of a few people that had more than that, but usually somewhere in the 8 to 10 pound range. So definitely heavier trigger pull. It's much harder to charge. One person that I know that uses it, foot charges it, puts it down on the ground and stomps on the charging handle, which works. It's definitely a beefy enough charging handle you can do that with, but it's just that hard. It's not easy at all. And it is harder to control just because it's a more powerful round and are still a relatively light gun. But for a lot of people, Sub 2000 would not be a bad option at all. But if you're like me, you're really concerned about the weight, and you are also concerned about the recoil, and you're willing to put up with all the magazine issues, the CMR-30 by Kel-Tec is actually a great little gun, and once you get the magazine issues figured out, a very reliable gun. Alright, that's all I have to say. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and I hope you found this beneficial and you got something out of it. What do you do with the CMR-30? Is there a fix for the CMR-30 mags? Turns out there is. There's a few different things that you need to know about the CMR-30 mags, which I discussed, and once you know those, it becomes a great little gun. So like Nut and Fancy, I would caution people about it. It's not an every person kind of gun. Certainly not. And if you're looking for something that's going to be out of the box reliable, definitely not for you. But if you have the time to invest in modifying the magazines as you need, and if you're someone that the benefits of the gun in terms of being able to get quick follow-up shots, lighter weight, light recoil, if all of that makes sense to you and that's something that you want, then go ahead and consider it. But for most other people that don't fall into that particular category, yeah, you're probably better off with a Sub 2000 or something like that. But for those people who are like me, it really is a cool gun. And another thing that's about it that I just like is the cool factor. This gun is probably the cheapest alternative to an MP7 that you're going to find, and you can see in the gun that it really does kind of have that MP7 feel to it. It's basically an oversized handgun that shoots a fairly small round and holds a lot of them, and you can just hammer away with it. It's a poor man's MP7 is what it really is. It definitely has a lot of what Nut and Fancy would call second cool going on. And I think you would agree with me on that one, that it really does kind of fill that particular niche of guys who really like the MP7 but can never get one in real life. This is the closest you're going to get, especially for the cost. So maybe you'll like it for that reason, I don't know. So again, very similar to Nut and Fancy. I would definitely recommend caution in getting this gun, but I would not do what Nut and Fancy did in saying that it's a complete disavowal. I would say that for some people who are willing to put in the time and effort, this will be a great gun. But if you're not on that list of people that is willing to put in the time and also has need for something that has light recoil and very lightweight compared to like a Sub 2000 or something like that, just a little bit lighter and especially lighter ammo. If you're like me and you like to carry a few hundred rounds with you just in case you're at a place where you can shoot recreationally, you can take advantage of it, and all the rest of the time you have to haul those rounds around. If you're like me in that regard, it makes sense. I admit that that's probably not most people, so yeah, still recommend caution, but I would not say that it's a complete non-recommend. I would recommend it with the qualifications that you need to learn how the magazine works, and there's 3 big things there. Do you know how to load the magazine properly? Are you willing to take the time to do it properly? Are you going to take the time to actually sand down the follower if you need to, if it doesn't slide back and forth like it's supposed to? And then are you willing to buy some blue Loctite to put on the bottom of the catch so that the magazine is all the way up in the mag well? If you're able to do all that, and the gun otherwise fits your purpose of use, either as a bug out kit option like nutnfancy recommends, or in my case, a traveling bedside gun. If all of those things are met, go for it. Go for it with confidence. Okay, just know what you're getting into, but know that once you get past all that stuff, it is a fantastic little gun. And like I said, everyone who shot it, now that I've got the magazines where they are supposed to be, everyone who shot it since then, when I first had it, yeah, people didn't like it so much, but ever since I fixed the issues with the magazines, everyone who shot that gun loves it. It is just a fun gun, and the fact that it is so easy to connect with it, especially at relatively short ranges, makes it a whole lot of fun. Because like I said, the group, when you're just firing fairly rapidly at relatively close ranges, is still relatively small, and you can hit, you know, most practical targets with it that way. Fun little gun, and any gun that you connect with, and especially connect easily with, is going to be fun, and it does that job very, very, very well. All right, I've rambled enough. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Bye-bye.